I used to think that the sound of a gavel was the only way to settle a score, but after 20 years of swimming through the shark-infested waters of maritime law, I realized that some people don and oppose. Want justice. They just want to own the horizon. My name is Elias Thorne, and a few years back, I walked away from a corner office in Seattle that smelled like expensive scotch and disappointment because I was tired of being the man who helped corporations find loopholes in the ocean's heart. I'd spent 2 decades arguing about hull liability and riparian boundaries for clients who wouldn't know a barnacle from a gemstone. And one morning, I just couldn't into oppose. Look at my reflection in the elevator glass anymore. So, I took what was left of my sanity, bought a rusted-out 1988 Chevy Silverado, and headed for a stretch of the South Carolina coast that everyone else had forgotten, where the marsh grass grows tall enough to hide your sins, and the air tastes like salt and ancient secrets. I ended up buying a plot of land that most people would call a liability. 3 acres of wild, wind-beaten coastline with a fishing shack that looked like it was being held together by nothing but stubbornness and oyster shells. I got it at a county auction for 30 grand, mostly because the deed was so old the ink was fading into the paper, but that deed, dated 1947, was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. It wasn't just a piece of property. It was a promise of, end quote, unencumbered access and historic wharfage rights, end quote, a legal relic from a time before suburban sprawl tried to put a price tag on the tide. I remember the first morning I stood on that sagging porch, watching the sun crawl out of the Atlantic like a bruised orange, and for the first time in my life, I didn't oppose. Feel like I was billable. I just felt human. But the thing about peace is that it's a magnet for people who haven and oppose. Found their own, and it didn't oppose. Take long for the manicured world next door to notice that end quote, drifter end quote, had moved into their peripheral vision. The end quote, world next door end quote, was the Azure Cove Estates, a gated community of pastel-color mansions that looked like they'd been birthed by a real estate brochure, and the queen of that hive was a woman named Beatrice Vane. Beatrice was the kind of person who wore pearls to the beach and looked at the ocean as if it were a private swimming pool she was gracious enough to let the fish live in. She was the president of the Azure Cove HOA, a title she carried with the weight of a Supreme Court justice, and she didn't oppose, like my shack. To her, my weathered cedar boards and overgrown dunes were end quote, blight on the collective aesthetic, end quote, a phrase she used the first time she trespassed onto my sand, flanked by a local deputy who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. She told me, with a smile that never reached her eyes, that my end quote, structure end quote, was in violation of community setback codes, and that her residents were end quote, disturbed end quote, by the sight of a man rebuilding a dock that hadn't oppose. Seen a boat in 40 years. I remember leaning against my truck, wiping grease off my hands, and just looking at her, thinking about how many women like Beatrice I defended in my old life. I told her, as politely as a man with a hammer can, that my property predated her development by half a century and that my deed was beholden to the state, not her committee of lawn care enthusiasts. Her face didn't oppose. Just fall. It hardened into a mask of pure, bureaucratic malice, and she whispered that, end quote, Azure Cove has ways of protecting its value, Mr. Thorne, end quote. That was the moment the war started, and let me tell you, an HOA with a grudge is a more dangerous animal than any corporate board I've ever faced because they don and oppose. Care about the law. They care about the feeling of the boot on the neck. By the following Monday, the harassment campaign began in earnest, starting with end quote, stop work, end quote, order from the county's environmental board that was so vague it was clearly a favor called in over a country club lunch. They claimed my dock restoration was threatening end quote, sensitive nesting site, end quote, for a species of bird I'm fairly certain doesn't end oppose, to even live in this hemisphere. And every time I turn around, there was a new inspector on my land. One guy was measuring the height of my grass, another was checking the chemical composition of my gravel, and through it all, Beatrice would sit in her white Mercedes at the edge of my driveway, just watching, a silent vulture in designer sunglasses. It's a lonely feeling when the system you spent your life studying starts to eat you alive, and I watched my bank account dwindle as the legal fees to fight the injunctions started to pile up. I tried to keep working, tried to stay quiet, but then came the night of the red tide, as I call it now. I woke up at 2 a.m. to the sound of splashing and low voices, and by the time I got to the window, all I saw were two figures disappearing into the dunes. When the sun came up, I realized they hadn't oppos. T just vandalized the shack. They'd dumped 5 gallons of industrial red paint over my new cypress decking and spray painted removal pending across the side of my home. But Beatrice had made one fatal mistake that only a lawyer who spent 20 years in the mud would notice. She thought I was just a tired old man with a hammer, and she forgot that I knew exactly where the bodies are buried in maritime records. You see, a few days before the paint incident, I'd been doing some late-night digging into the historical literal surveys of the county, and I found something that made my blood run cold and then boil with a beautiful, righteous heat. The entire southern half of the Azure Cove private beach the one they charge their members $5,000 a year to access, wasn't in oppos. Actually their land. Back in the late 40s, the federal government had designated that specific stretch of coastline as a navigational emergency easement for the nearby naval yard. And according to the 1947 deed I held in my shaking hands, my little fishing shack was the official landward sentinel for that easement. In plain English, that meant Beatrice's precious community had built their cabanas, their boardwalks, and their private gazebos on land that was, by federal law, a public thoroughfare and a protected maritime corridor. I didn't oppose. T called the police about the paint. Not yet, because I wanted to see how far she would go, and she didn't oppose. T disappoint. She hired a contractor who turned out to be a disgraced ex-cop named Miller to sit on the edge of my property and harass any delivery trucks trying to bring me lumber. Miller would stand there with a camera, filming my every move, trying to goad me into a fight so they could slap me with a restraining order, but I just smiled at him and offered him coffee because I was busy building a dossier that would make a RICO prosecutor weep with joy. I had the infrared footage of Beatrice herself. Yes, the Queen of Pearls, holding the flashlight while her nephew poured that red paint on my deck, and I had the financial records of the HOA that showed she'd been funneling in beach maintenance and funds into a shell company she owned. The climax came on a Tuesday, the kind of humid, heavy morning where you can feel the lightning before you see it, and Beatrice showed up with a bulldozer and a local sheriff's deputy I'd never seen before. She handed me a piece of paper she claimed was an emergency demolition order for a hazardous structure, and for a second, I saw the genuine triumph in her eyes, the look of a woman who had finally erased a blemish from her perfect world. I looked at the bulldozer, then at the deputy, and then I pulled a thick blue-bound folder from my truck. I didn't oppose. TL. I just spoke in that low, courtroom vibrato that used to make junior partners tremble, and I told the deputy that if that machine moved 1 inch closer to a federal sentinel site, he'd be answering to the Department of the Interior before sunset. I watched the color drain from Beatrice's face as I handed the deputy the federal surveys, the 1947 deed, and the cease and desist order I'd spent 48 hours drafting with my old firm's letterhead, a firm that, by the way, still owed me a very large favor. I told her, right there in front of the man she'd hired to destroy my home, that not only was my shack staying, but that her private beach was officially being reclassified as a public park. The look of sheer, unadulterated horror on her face when she realized she'd spent millions of her neighbors in oppos, dollars to protect land they never owned was better than any settlement check I'd ever signed. Within an hour, the bulldozer was gone. And within a week, the federal marshals were at her front door to talk about the misappropriation of HOA funds and the tiny little problem of vandalizing a federally protected historic site. The fall of Beatrice Vane was a slow, spectacular collapse that provided enough gossip to fuel the county for a decade, and as the Azure Cove HOA was dissolved into a state-mandated receivership, the gates to that private beach were literally taken off their hinges. Now, when I sit on my porch, newly scrubbed with that red paint and smelling of fresh cedar, I don an oppos. Just see the ocean. I see the families from town who used to be blocked by keep out in quote, signs now walking their dogs along the sand. I see the kids skipping stones on the water that Beatrice thought she could put a padlock on, and I realize that the law ISN and oppos, a weapon after all. It's just a way to make sure the truth doesn't and oppos, get buried under too much luxury. But here's the thing that still keeps me up at night, and it's something I want to ask you all, because the more I look at the houses in Azure Cove, the more I wonder about the people who live there. They wearin and oppos, all like Beatrice. Most of them were just people who wanted a nice view and were willing to pay for the illusion of exclusivity. They watched me get harassed, they watched the paint go up, and they stayed silent because they were afraid of losing their property value or their social standing in the neighborhood. So, I have to ask, at what point does, in quote, wanting a nice life, in quote, turn into being an accomplice to a bully? If you saw a neighbor being choked out by a system you paid for, would you speak up? Or would you just close your blinds and hope your lawn stays green? Because from where I'm sitting, the real, in quote, blight on the aesthetic, in quote, wasn't oppos, my shack. It was the silence from the houses next door. I'd love to hear what you think about HOA power, about who really owns the land we live on, and if you've ever had to fight in quote, Beatrice, in quote, in your own life. Drop a comment below, because the tide is finally coming in, and I think it's time we all started talking about what's actually worth protecting.